I'm going to do something similar to what I did with the aquatic plants. I'm going to group these by their similarities. So we're going to talk about a few families that have a lot in common and emphasize their differences. So the families we'll talk about are grouped by being wind pollinated and having their male flowers arranged into catkins. So catkins are illustrated here. Catkin is a pendant or a hanging, dangling inflorescence. And it's got male flowers in there, lots of little male flowers. You can see these larger bits are bracts on there. So bracts associated with one or more flowers. And then you can just see the anthers are the shapes in there. What this means is this whole structure produces a whole lot of pollen. That's its main purpose. And by being a hanging, dangling structure, that means it moves around when the wind blows. So by being wind pollinated, it helps maybe to release some more of that pollen as the wind blows. So wind blowing causes more pollen to come out, also ends up being a good time to transport that pollen. So we'll see the families that are represented here, and also point out on here that we have separate male and female flowers. So mention the male flowers on the catkin. The female flowers are actually right here in these little cones. They don't look like much, so wind pollinated flowers tend not to be conspicuous. They're kind of in these little cone structures, and that's the current year's receptive female flowers. And they don't look like much. They're catching pollen out of the air. Once they've been fertilized, they're going to take a while to develop into these, which will develop over the course of the year. These are basically look like pine cones, but they're actually produced by this flowering plant. Woody cones, and they have catkins inside of there. So this plant with male and female flowers, unisexual, but on the same plant, makes this one monoecious, and that's a common theme for these plant families that I'll talk about here. So we'll start in with Betulaceae. Betulaceae named for this genus of birch, Betula. Also Corylus, the hazel, and Australia, the, hop hornbeam. A lot of similarity here. These are all in the same family. You wouldn't really necessarily tell them apart by their overall appearance of the catkins, but you can tell them apart by other features. Betulaceae, another one, Fagaceae here, named for the genus Fagus. This is the genus of beech. And over here we have oaks, Quercus. A little bit difference here. We see the oaks in particular have their male flowers separated, look more like beads on a string than that one unified lumpy catkin structure. So maybe a little helpful here, but overall the catkin appearance, a little more commonly something like this. These are, again, pretty similar to what we saw in Betulaceae. This is another family, Juglandaceae. Juglans, the walnuts, Caria, the hickories, and Salicaceae, again, lots of male flowers clustered together on these pendant catkins. Populus, this is the aspens and the cottonwoods. That's the genus there. A little bit, sometimes some cheating in willows. The Salix is the willow genus. This one is actually an erect male inflorescence. So not quite fitting in with catkin, but it does have lots of male flowers on there. So we're going to let it pass as maybe an erect catkin. So as I mentioned, this group of families, I'm grouping them together by having this structure in common. Pretty common through all of them. Now let's see if we can tell them apart. So one way you can first tell these families apart is their female reproductive structures. And I'm going to group a few of the Betulaceae genera together here, and then also another category. So one kind of Betulaceae inflorescence and really infructescent. So as they're developing into the fruit-bearing structures, they look like cones. So I mentioned these that look like basically very much like pine cones, similar function. They protect the seeds until they open. This is an immature version all sealed up, and then the mature version ready to release those seeds in the ulnus. And then over here in Betula, a little more papery, but still very cone-like appearance. And then a little bit of difference heading out into these other genera. A little more emphasis on the big bracts. So here's the akene there with a big triangular bract associated with it. These big puffy, they're like air bladder bracts, they've got seeds associated with them. And then here in the hazel, there's a nut inside of there, and then these big leafy bracts surrounding it. So a couple different, I think it might be helpful to think about Betulaceae as cones or big leafy bracts. Some of those kind family Fagaceae has its unifying features in canes that are surrounded by lots of overlapping bracts. So here is a very young oak flower. It kind of gives you a little more feel for what you've got when you've got an oak acorn. So the fruit type for an acorn, it's an akene. So draw a little acorn here. So what's going on when you got an acorn? Why should this nut have a hat? Right? So the kind of crisscross appearance here, each of these little squares that I've drawn on there is an area that would be like the termination of a single overlapping bract there. So they do kind of overlap and cover the nut here. And that's the fruit type. So a nut or an akene. But they're not really doing a lot of protecting up there. So what's going on? Well, they do a lot more protecting in the fruiting stage. So as this flower is younger, it would be more enclosed in those overlapping bracts. And then after this ovary ovule is fertilized, then it goes on to become the nut. The nut gets bigger and kind of outgrows its protection. And then it ends up with its own protection. So as a nut, it has a pretty hard outside, as you might know. We've watched squirrels experience nuts. But this is an oak in a very young stage. And similar to beech, genus Fagus, this one is nuts that are pretty well surrounded by those overlapping bracts. And you can see just with these little prickly bits out here, these are the individual bract leaves that are overlapping to cover those nuts. Chestnut here in the flowering stage, and then over here in the fruiting stage. Moving on to Juglandaceae, we've got also nuts enclosed in bracts. This is a case of fewer bracts, and the individual bracts are rather thick. So this is a pecan on the left here. Pecan is in the same genus as hickory. Also walnuts. You might know that walnuts have big thick rind on the outside. This is them in their early developmental stage. You got stigmas up here, and then even at this stage, the ovary surrounded by these bracts. And then maybe more familiar to you, the fruits they develop into. These are hickory nuts and walnuts, and they both have this big fleshy covering around them. So the hickory, I like this illustration, shows that they've got different stages. So a rather complete green fruit with those big bracts on the outside. And then as it dries out, it goes more to brown and can break open. This one breaks open along these four seams and releases a nut, which is just a proper nut there. This is the hickory nut. Walnuts, sometimes they do more of that dehiscence. Sometimes, in my experience, this kind, the black walnut, is basically at the mercy of the squirrels that tend to find them. And the squirrels will chew off all this rind, get down to the nut proper, often bury that or stash that for the winter, and then come back and eat them a little bit later with their amazing rodent powers. So the fact of being a rodent allows them to chew through this pericarp, which is actually really woody, really tough, amazingly protective, but squirrels can get in there. Okay, so big bracts, a little more during development, and then also all the way to mature fruits, characteristic of Juglandaceae. Salicaceae, you'll maybe remember from the phylogeny, this one is set off from the others. So this is in a different group, and they've got different fruit types. So those others had achenes as their fruit type, and Salicaceae has capsules as its fruit type. And there's a pretty consistent feature of things being hairy. So I mentioned the pussy willows before. Plants called pussy willows have hair around their inflorescence. This is an aspen with some hairy associations around its, these are the capsules here, and then they've got like hairy bracts associated with them. And as we'll see later, the seeds inside of these capsules are also hairy. So hairs all around. Features you might use to tell these families apart also include their venation. So here we've got Betulaceae again, pinnate leaf venation and serrate margins, sometimes doubly serrate. So some people use this as a pretty useful characteristic to tell their Betulaceae. And to be doubly serrate means is that you've kind of got a broad pattern of bigger teeth, and the bigger teeth are made up of little teeth. So if you had just a broad, like a coarsely serrate margin, it would look like this. This one is doubly serrate, so it's teeth throughout, but small teeth combining together to be part of these big teeth. And you can maybe convince yourself that you see it on here. Some of these teeth a little bit bigger, big tooth, big tooth, big tooth, big tooth, big tooth. Here pretty nicely, big tooth, big tooth, big tooth, big tooth. So sort of that pattern might be helpful. I'd say it's not like fully universal here, but sometimes helpful. Fagaceae, if you know oaks, this is a very typical oak leaf with these deep lobes, lobes that are rounded at the tips or pointy, but definitely oak lobing. Not all oaks do that, especially if you go farther south, you can get into oaks that have a little more just simple leaves like these. So unlobed leaves in the beech, genus Fagus, or chestnut, Castanea. Here we're back to pinnate venation and just big teeth on the margins. So a little bit different from that serrate, finely serrate leaf margin we saw in Betulaceae. Juglandaceae has nice distinctive leaves. We've got pinnately compound leaves in that case. Carry of the hickories, few leaves, a few leaflets per leaf, and then the walnut a little bit more, but both of these pinnately compound. Haven't mentioned it up to this point, but all the families I'm talking about here are also alternate phyllotaxis, so that'll be helpful for identifying those. Leaves in Salicaceae, similar to some of these other ones, sometimes they're helpful. I'd say the shape of an aspen leaf is pretty distinctive, or a cottonwood has this deltoid triangular shape to it. Some of our willows have this long lanceolate feature. Others of our willows may be a little less descript, so elliptic or ovate. This one looks a little obovate. But again, we've got pinnate venation, as we've seen in a few cases. Sometimes the bark is helpful. I'll mention some cases where I think bark might be helpful to learn. Our birches often have this peeling in sheets kind of bark. So the paper birch gets its name that way, kind of peels off like a sheet of paper. Also tends to be pretty bright white. This is a yellow birch peeling in sheets, but a little more haphazardly. And then also in Betulaceae, some of these, this one is muscle wood, has a trunk of a tree and limbs that kind of look like a sinewy muscle person flexing. So maybe useful for identifying Betulaceae, at least a piece of information you can use while you're trying to consider what you're identifying. And then just a little heads up that if you're looking for that feature to help you identify your birches, you want to watch out for some of the members of Salicaceae. So aspens are kind of noteworthy as often confusing people who think they might be birches for having this white bark, a little less like paper and more like a skin on the outside of that tree. Fruit type, as I mentioned, is akene pretty commonly in these different groups. So akenes in Betulaceae, these cones in the alder, they have woody bracts on there, but inside of there are individual akenes. These are the alder akenes in the birch. They've got little wings on them to help them disperse. So samaras, if they've got wings, akenes, if they don't have wings. Economic importance, there's this one here, hazelnuts. We have native hazelnuts, and then the little more widespread commercial hazelnut is from Europe. And you can make a lovely chocolate spread. I mean, hazelnut spread out of them. Put enough sugar on that, it is delicious. Fagaceae has the oaks. They're big importance ecologically, economically. And then for edible plants, the chestnuts are one of our edible plants. There's an emoji for chestnut here. Tells you it's kind of significant. Some people eat beech nuts, so Fagus beech nuts. Edible, a little bit more on the small side. I've never had them myself. The kind of went into this with Juglandaceae. This is another illustration of how these nuts kind of come out of those bracts. So these are a couple of the commercially important nuts. So commercially used walnuts, commercially used pecans, with their bracts kind of giving up on them. So nice way to harvest those for people. You might have had these in the shell where you have to get them out of the shell yourself. So locally, the hickory genus for us has hickory, butternut, pecan, not so much local to us, a little more of a southern species, and then walnuts in the genus Juglans. Salicaceae, as I mentioned, have capsules for their fruit, and then the individual seeds, nicely illustrated here, have lots of hair associated with them. So one of the species in this family is the cottonwood, and that gives its name, or gets its name from having these cottony hairs associated with the seeds. They're pretty prolific, so if you're near a waterway that has cottonwoods, you'll see at that certain time of year, they just sort of snow down these cottony seeds all over the place.